Okay, welcome to the media literacy workshop. And today we are covering the last topic in the area of bias. We will discuss how to address bias in media. In this session, you will first learn how to locate bias in media and then how to address bias or how to deal with bias in media. You will have lots of examples from media, how bias is located and addressed. And also, following this session, you will prepare a presentation on your experience of addressing bias in media. The perspective for this presentation is that we have talked about pictures, how each of us perceive different pictures differently. If you remember, I have presented several pictures where we discussed whether they were different objects, and to each of us, they seemed very different, which means that our perspectives play a key role in locating bias. We have to strive hard to see both sides. Now, continuing the previous topic, today we will talk about types of bias in detail. So we have introduced bias, we have discussed how bias happens because of the perception and because of the intention of the publishers or producers of media. And now, in order to locate bias successfully, we have to know exact situations where bias can appear. So the very first one is bias by omission. So what kind of bias is, let's say, happens as a result of omission? So when you read an article, leaving one side out of an article or a series of articles over a period of time, or in the news, ignoring the facts that tend to disprove liberal claims or that support conservative beliefs, and others can be examples of bias by omission. So when bias by omission happens within a story, some part of the story is omitted. In order to find instances of bias by omission, you have to be informed. You should come with your background knowledge on the topic. So if you feel like there is something is missing from the story, then do some research and try to gather additional information on the topic. And then you will make sure if something is omitted from the story or not. So in order to detect bias by omission, we have to arm ourselves with knowledge and facts. Next type of bias is bias by source selection. Bias by selection of sources happens a lot. So sometimes you notice that news stories or other media, even textbooks, include some sources more than others, which means that they promote views of certain sources compared to other sources. So bias can also be seen when a reporter uses the phrases of experts believe, observers say, most people believe. While it seems like scholarly statement, experts believe is no fact. Observers say is still no fact. And most people believe does not make the event true. Also, when you can see prosecution events on media and there is an expert witness to the stand, you know which way the witness will testify. Because the witness is brought by one side on the court and testifies for the benefit of one side. Just like this, bias by source selection acts like a witness on the courtroom. So they testify on one side of the event. But in order to see what is the real story, you will have to take a look at other sources. If you analyze any type of media, be it news, article, image, or others, pay attention to the sources. Does the information come from the same source? Does the information provided by the same group of people, does it include many perspectives or narrow perspective of only a few sources? So not all stories will include experts, but in those that do, make sure that there is equal number of sources. So if you feel like that news or media is being reported or produced on one side only, you can address the situation by searching for other sources and comparing those sources with the source mentioned in the media. Next type of bias is story selection bias or bias by story selection. So it's often we notice that some stories are more highlighted than others. Some news stories can appear on the TV quite a few times during the day, while some stories are made short and never repeated. That is called agenda. So when story is selected and one story promoted, always make sure that there is bias behind it, especially when you watch news about politics, economy, war, and other topics that actually make the news media run. They do select their stories. If you watch TV or if you browse your social media and one news story appears a lot frequently than others, then make sure that there is bias by story selection. Next type of bias is bias by placement. We will watch a short video on bias by placement in today's lesson as well. So story placement is a measure of how important the editor considers the story. Some stories appear on the first page of the newspapers, in the morning news that everyone watches, or it can appear as the pinned message to your social media pages. Studies prove that newspaper readers or news viewers or online news readers, they tend to read the beginning of or very first pages of news quite often. So it's easier to locate that the story that's placed in the front than stories placed in, let's say, at the end of the story, at the end of the article, at the end of the page. So by placement, bias can enter media. So how stories are placed in your favorite newspaper, on your favorite television show, or how they appear on your social media, that has something to do with bias, as placement can already, well, invite bias to this page. Next type of bias is labeling. Bias by labeling comes in two formats. The first is tagging of certain groups, and the second is, well, when false definitions are presented about the other side. So in the first case, something is labeled as positive. So they keep telling you that this is a good thing. So those people are heroic, they are doing something good, and it can repeat. On the other hand, they can label the other group as negatives. So they can keep calling them, let's say, hackers, terrorists, and others. So labeling or name calling is one of the ways that media producers induce bias in the media. Next type of bias is bias by spin. Bias by spin occurs when the story has only one interpretation of event or policy, while it excludes the other interpretation. Spin involves tone, reporters' comments about the facts, and also the perspective that is supported by that media producer. So in order to check if media contains bias by spin, you have to observe which interpretation of an event or policy a news story matches. Is it a liberal or is it conservative? Does it serve one group or does it serve the other? So this is the way that you can identify and address spin or bias by spin. So we have talked a lot about what is bias. Now question comes, what isn't bias? There is a huge amount of bias happening in media, and it's crucial to be able to see what isn't bias. Well, what isn't bias is divided into two broad categories. First, editorials or opinion columns. So opinion columns often come with newspapers, and then we have talk shows where different people on TV present their worldview, outlook, and opinions. We have blogs or forums or chat rooms in social media. These are created with the purpose of expressing opinion. So while some opinion may represent certain groups or contain bias, they are not referred as biased media, as the primary intention of such columns or blogs are to promote free thinking and freedom of speech. The second category of what isn't biased is non-policy stories on a specific event that don't have to be balanced. That can be a scientific story, it can be a story about philosophy and others. So you find less bias in media that does not deal about politics, while media that deals with politics offers you lots of opportunities for locating bias. Now, you have to always remember that there are different items within bias. You have to carefully analyze every news story, and it's important to report the stories in an unbiased way, because sometimes even if we read or we consume balanced media, we tend to add our perspective when reporting this media to other person, or we select certain stories on social media, for example, and send it to our friends. We also choose which media to promote, which news to spread, and etc. So as a consumer, we also contribute to bias. It's important to analyze, locate, and address bias in media, while it's equally important to keep balanced, let's say, perspective on any media when sharing this media with others as a consumer. And last but not least, bias can happen in photos as well. As you can see, two photos, the photo on the left and photo on the right represent two different views into a famous person. So you have to carefully analyze pictures in the news stories as well in order to find examples of bias. Well, now we are going to discuss some of the headlines, stories, and others from the media, mostly from newspapers. Take a look at the four statements, and I want you to rank the headlines from most biased to least biased. The headlines are right here. So the first one is, war imminent as Hussein rejects ultimatum. Butcher tells US, come and get me. Saddam scorns US ultimatum. Baghdad rejects Bush's warning. So we have 4 different headlines about one particular event. So there is an ultimatum presented by the USA to Iraq, and that was rejected. 4 different producers of media have created headlines to represent this event. Take a look at the headlines and please tell me which headline is the most biased and which one is the least biased. And please explain your worldview. You can unmute yourself and participate in the discussion, or if you prefer, you can type your answers into the chat box. If you need some time to spend on the headlines, yes, sure. Go ahead and read the headlines again. And while reading, you have to pay attention to the words that strongly reflect prejudiced point of view. They will help you to analyze which headline is the most biased. Is there anyone who would like to discuss it already? Okay, let's hear from Munawar. Hello,
Can I
Munawar.
share?
How are you doing?
Hi, good evening. Fine, thanks.
Nice to hear from you. So what do you think about those headlines, Munawar? What's your view? So which one is most biased? Which one is least biased?
I start doing the second task, circling the words which feels most strongly.
Okay.
And here it was about ultimatum, because this word is the main, can be a main word in the period of the war. So first and third one is going to be most biased.
Okay.
And the second and fourth is going to be least biased. So
second one is least biased, you think?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that is there any headline that reflects a clear position on the war? So balanced position, which one would you pick as the least biased again? So with a clear position, balanced and without bias. Pick one.
When the first one, Baghdad rejects Bush's warning, this can be a point when Baghdad telling it is clear position in the war.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Munawar, so much. So what about the others? Do you guys have something to say about this headlines? So Najima, what would you think? You can try typing your answers in the chat box as well. Okay, so Munawar had a very good discussion and she paid attention to the words, keywords, and tried to identify which headline was most biased and which one was least biased. So the first headline says, war imminent as Hussein rejects ultimatum. Here you can see that they are paying more attention to the situation. Can you see the, let's say here, can you see here that they are trying to name call someone? No, they are mentioning the names as it is. Probably they are trying to put the event in the first place, then their perspectives. So probably it's not the very biased one, while it still has some pro-US view, as can be seen, Hussein mentioning the name instead of the leader of Iraq and others already reflects bias. Second one, Butcher tells US, come and get me. We know that butcher is not a good way of calling someone. So butcher, that's a person who deals with meat, right? Calling a leader of a country butcher is pretty much, let's say, huge bias. It's already showing that they are adding a lot of perspective here. So labeling is happening here and it's heavily biased. Saddam scorns US ultimatum. So here it reflects the position of the leader of Iraq, but again, it's one point of view. It does not give, let's say, a clear view to what is actually happening. While the first one, as Munavar has mentioned, Baghdad rejects Bush's warning, that's probably a better way of addressing this event in headline because it selects event as the main, let's say, concentration area. It does not label anyone and it just gives insight into what's happening. There was warning by President Bush and Baghdad, so the government of Iraq rejected. Probably first one is the least biased statement. So you have to be careful and you have to remember where bias can appear. Bias by placement, bias by omission, bias by labeling, bias by pictures. So when you can locate bias, then you will be able to identify bias. And while you do so, you will be able to, let's say, use the story or consume the story in a more balanced way. Thank you for your participation. And turning to the next one, we still have some discussion questions, and I'm sure that those discussion questions will help you to get more insight into today's topic. Well, we have already talked about which headlines reflect strongest bias. Now, can headline alone show that this media contains a lot of bias? Or can headline be false? So you read the headline and you decide that the story is biased or unbiased. But is it always accurate? Do you think that if story is biased, it will be biased starting from the headline? Or headline isn't that important in identifying bias? Well, yes, Manavar, please.
Now, looking at these questions, I realized that before the session and before watching the previous video, I assumed that bias is something that media producers keep as a secret, not telling everyone of the society about what is going on in our lives. But now, during this session, now I have realized that bias is not only not telling everything, but journalists can tell, but not in the first line, not fully. So I understood that there are many ways of biasing in media. So media producers can limit the data, or they can give, first of all, another less important thing, and then bias in the middle, and then it will be covered by another less important information, so the reader will skip, kind of. And in the other part, for example, when they bias by story selection, so they will tell the information that, but they will be from another perspective. And now I have understood that why we don't have to judge personal blogs for their unbiased information, because they they run personal blogs, so they are free to express their ideas. But previously, before the session, I thought if they are blogger or if they are a journalist, they need to give the fact correctly. And here about the last question about being unbiased when reporting on a war, my idea is that war is not a good thing that everyone will watch like watching a football. So when we deal with this kind of social impactful events, it is better for journalists, for bloggers, for everyone to be unbiased. Even one member of a society who is not a journalist can tell or can report a biased information for others. So here in this kind of things in the period of war, or it can be, for example, 2 years before in the period of pandemic or COVID, the people need to be trusted. So this kind of situation demands us to be unbiased rather than, so if it's about the football, if it's about one cinema, one theater performance, that the people can share their personal ideas, so it's okay to be listened. But war or this kind of pandemic situations need to be unbiasedly reported for everyone. So these are my ideas, and I'm really thankful for the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manavar. Your ideas are very insightful, and it shows that you gained some understanding into what is bias, how to locate it, and we are really happy for it. Thank you for participating actively in the discussion. So others might also leave some of their comments in the chat box. And now we will turn into propaganda. So propaganda is one form of bias. It's an organized program of publicity used to promote the acceptance or rejection of belief, practice, person, or ideology. So it's basically propagating or promoting one idea while totally ignoring or omitting the other idea. Well, propaganda is not always a negative thing. Sometimes it is used for good intentions, for promoting healthy lifestyle, for promoting good deeds, and others. But propaganda is always manipulative. It tries to manipulate your emotions rather than helping you to make a logical argument. For this reason, you have to be careful about propaganda as well. So propaganda techniques are several. They are pretty much similar to the ones that bias involves. Well, some of the common techniques used in propaganda is hero narrative. So when propaganda happens within media, some figures are portrayed as heroes. So, for example, if they are propagating army of or if they are propagating certain groups, they will describe them in a heroic way that you would like to join them, making you think that you admire them or you want to be part of that group. Another technique used for propaganda is misinformation. So misinformation is the heart of propaganda. In its simplest form, misinformation presents something that's not true as true. So there is a historical event that never happened, and then they start propagating it. Um, so you would perceive this event as true. Well, another basic form of misinformation is when propaganda tries to hide the actual fact. So Wikipedia is now a good educational resource, but we know that Wikipedia can be edited by everyone and misinformation can happen a lot. Just like this, propaganda use misinformation as a tool to promote certain ideas. So you are not fed with correct ideas on purpose. Well, denialism is another technique that propaganda use. Denialism is a form of misinformation in which the author claims that something that is generally accepted as being true is not. So there is a lot going on around the information about astronauts visiting the moon, and there is still controversy theories claiming that it never happened, it was filmed on Hollywood grounds. Just like this, there are many so-called facts that have already taken the shape of ideas. Just like this, denialism or denying something that never happened, even though there are facts for proving that it did happen, is a form of propaganda. And of course, loaded language. Some words carry a lot of emotional power, and propaganda makes good use of those words to manipulate the consumers of media. Often these words are about nationalism, religion, and other ideologies that people really, let's say, take personally. Loaded language can also be used to describe things in a way that affects how we feel about them. So rebels are fighting against the government, and well, they can be called terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on what is promoted by certain media. So propaganda, just like bias, serves serves the benefit of certain groups, and that's why it's dangerous. You have to be very careful about propaganda. If something is defined as too good or too bad, more or less likely it's propaganda. So you have to be very careful in order to not to be a prey of propaganda. Mainstreaming is last technique we will discuss today as tool used for propagating ideas. So this technique tries to convince you that message being promoted through propaganda is already widely accepted. So, for example, again, we'll come back to the example of Wikipedia. For students now, Wikipedia is #1 source whenever they write papers. While if you notice, even Wikipedia itself argues that Wikipedia articles can be edited by anyone and it's not a reliable source. But Wikipedia is so common, so mainstream, it has become the main source for many people to address. Just like this, mainstreaming can be used as a technique for propaganda. So you see that it's accepted by many people, and then you start believing that it's true while it's not. So you have to be careful about mainstreaming as well. And about bandwagon, we have already discussed in our previous sessions. I do hope that you remember what was a bandwagon theory. So it's a type of mainstreaming that you follow a trend because everybody's doing it, or you accept some information in the media as true because everyone is repeating it, while it's not the case, right? And othering, well, othering is another technique uh, that tries to describe some other groups very different from us. That gives us the emotion of distance and describes them as very different people. And othering can make us have instinctive emotional reactions to members of that group. So usually when they talk about Afghanistan and Afghan people selling their children, we feel this othering that they are different from us. They are not even nearly human. So this kind of othering is also used in media or can be located in media, and it's one of the forms of propaganda. Well, propaganda can happen in pictures as well. Editorial cartoons are one of the tools used for propagating ideas. And of course, you have to consider every graph, every picture in the media in order to successfully locate bias and propaganda. In today's language learning part, we will talk about bias by placement. So please pay attention and take notes when necessary.
Hello, in this video we're going to discuss bias by placement. We'll talk about how the role of editors and sensationalism can lead to this type of bias. Bias by placement happens when stories that are important for our daily lives don't receive important placement in media messages. It can also happen when unimportant stories get important placement in media messages. Remember, important placement means that something is at the top of a page or at the beginning of a video or radio broadcast. First, let's talk about the role of editors. Remember that an editor is a person who makes changes to a media message so that it's appropriate for a target audience. They also decide which messages come first, second, and so on. Because they decide which stories are featured at the beginning of a video or at the top of a page, editors basically tell us how important a story is. For example, if a newspaper editor thinks that a story about the weather is important, then that story will be on the front page. Everyone will see this story. The placement of the weather story on the front page tells everyone, hey, this story is really important. And if the editor thinks that a different story, let's say about job growth, is unimportant, then that story will be on the last page, and most people won't see it. Even if they do turn to the last page for the story, they will probably think that it's not a very important story. In this way, editors can easily influence people's opinions about the news. This situation can lead to bias because editors might make choices about the importance of a story based on their personal points of view or their personal opinions, and you or I might not make the same choices. In other words, you might not agree with the editors about which stories are really important for your daily life or society in general. The second type of bias by placement that we're going to discuss comes from consuming news as entertainment. Another word for this is sensationalism. Sensationalism means using news media messages to entertain people instead of informing them about events that are important to their daily lives. Let's see an example of how this situation can lead to bias. Imagine that a famous actor from your country is arrested by the police because she was driving too fast. The next day, when you turn on your radio, you hear about this person's arrest. When you turn on the television news, you immediately see more information. You learn what kind of car she was driving, how fast she was going. On the front page of a newspaper, you learn about the other people in the car. Stories about this event are trending or becoming popular very quickly on social media, so you learn even more when you check Twitter and Facebook. The placement of this story in different types of media tells us that it's a very important story. But if we stop for a moment and ask ourselves, is this story important for my daily life? We might say no. In fact, this story probably has important placement in media only because it is entertaining and not because it will give us important information about our daily lives.
Okay, so I hope that you gained some essential insight into placement bias through this video and learned some key language. Now, this time you will not write a reflection. Instead, you will prepare a presentation, mind map presentation, and the next session you will be presenting yourself the information regarding bias. Full information about this whole assignment I will send to our Telegram group in a detailed instruction. So you will receive every information you need for this task. And next week, you will be presenting. You will be, let's say, taking up the floor and showing your first ever presentation.